LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, how to manage your emotions the easy way. Four years ago, Ethan Kross, a psychologist at the University of Michigan, published a book called Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. And then, like any first-time author trying to make his mark, he went on book tour.
And after I'd finished talking about Chatter, people would come up to me or in the audience, they would make comments about, thank you for talking about this. You know, this is such a common experience I've grappled with throughout my life. I have some tools now. But
the dreaded but. In city after city, at event after event, Ethan could not escape it. People were desperate to know,
what about when I'm angry? What about if I want to maximize joy? And what about if I want to rein in my sadness?
It was as if with Chatter, he'd shown them how their car's transmission works and given them tools to keep it running smoothly. And their response was, yeah, that's great, but my brakes are squeaking, the AC is busted, and there's this weird rattling noise when I go over 60. What am I supposed to do about that?
What just became abundantly clear to me through those experiences is that people are thirsting for an understanding of their emotional lives. Like, what are our emotions? Why do we have them? What do they do for us? Why do they gang up against us? And it turns out these are age-old questions that we've been grappling with, likely for as long as we've been roaming the planet.
So when his tour ended, Ethan went back home and started fleshing out a new book idea. This book, he decided, would be an instruction manual for understanding our emotions, what they are, why they matter, and most importantly, how to master them. That new book, Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You, comes out on February 4th. But Ethan was kind enough to sit down with me a few weeks early to give you all a sneak peek. What I love about this book is that it's practical, it's empowering, it's a do-it-yourself toolkit for managing your emotions from a guy who knows something about the subject. Ethan's not just a writer, he's the director of the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory at Michigan. And what he's found is that we've got to stop thinking about our emotions as good or bad. Instead, we should think of them as signals that if channeled properly, we can use to our advantage. Take envy, for example. Seems like a classically bad emotion, right? But can't envy inspire us to work harder? How about anger? You may think, well, there's nothing good there, but can't anger drive us to correct an injustice? The problem is, more often than not, we don't channel our emotions towards the outcomes we want. No, we stew, we ruminate, we wallow. We seek the shallow comforts of commiseration. This is where Ethan's idea of shifters comes in. These tools, which can be as simple as mood-based playlists or the photo on your phone's lock screen, can radically shift our emotional weather patterns. And so, for the next hour, Ethan's going to share some of his favorite tools with you. Tricks you can use to boost your spirits, resolve domestic spats, be a better friend, and build healthier cultures. They are simple. In fact, you may already be using some of them. But I think you'll find understanding the science behind these techniques is empowering. It can make you, as Ethan puts it, an emotional jiu-jitsu black belt.
If you're interested in the story behind the business headlines, check out Big Technology Podcast, my weekly show that features in-depth interviews with CEOs, researchers, and reformers in business and technology. Hi, I'm Alex Kantrowitz. I'm a longtime journalist, CNBC contributor, and the host of the show. I empty my Rolodex every Wednesday to bring you awesome episodes, so go check out Big Technology Podcast. It's available on all podcast apps. Would love to have you as a listener.
Ethan Kross, welcome back to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
you open the book with a wonderful metaphor for our emotions. You refer to them as our Stradivarius, referring to the beautifully crafted violins, right, that just make exquisite music. There's a kind of reverence for our emotional range, for the power of our emotional instrument, as it were, that's kind of implicit in that metaphor. Do you feel that, or do you feel a kind of awe for
Yeah.
our instrument?
I mean, I remember having an early discussion about this book when it was still a seed of an idea with a colleague. We were talking about emotions, and the colleague said, emotions are what make life worth living. They are the
Yeah.
essence of our lives. Most of the time that we're awake, and at least me, sometimes when I'm asleep too, I am
Yeah.
experiencing emotion, and it makes life interesting, and it makes life meaningful and worthwhile. The emotional experiences are the ones that I remember. They're the ones that I am reaching for. And so they're a beautiful, beautiful thing. And, another thing that's beautiful about our emotions, and it's a lot like the playing a Stradivarius, is you could play that instrument in lots of different ways. We all can make wonderful music
Yes.
with a tool, but there's no limitation on the kinds of music we create. And my emotional life is very different from yours.
Yeah.
And I don't know the details of your emotional life, but I could say that with confidence.
Yeah.
And it's different from my kids and my wife. And that, if you agree with that,
Yeah.
that segues to a really important point of the book, which is there's this discrepancy, right? I think most people do acknowledge that our emotions are incredibly unique and idiosyncratic.
Mm-hmm.
But then we are looking for typically one-size-fits-all solutions for managing this incredibly unique set of experiences that we and others have. That doesn't quite fit, right? Like, why
Right.
is it that I get asked on most occasions, tell me about the one thing people should do right now to manage their emotions?
Yeah.
Doesn't exist.
So I love this metaphor of emotions as a Stradivarius because it suggests to me that, there's something really precious here. I found myself, as I was reading the book, thinking of a different metaphor, which I can't resist sharing with you. I'm a bit of a car guy, Ethan, right? So I couldn't help but thinking of that our emotions shift automatically like an automatic transmission in a car, but it's an imperfect transmission. Sometimes we get stuck in one gear for too long, and you can't accelerate to highway speed if you're stuck in first or second gear. But we can learn to manually shift through the gears of our emotions. This is something that is learnable, and it helps us get to where we want to go effectively.
Yes. So we have the capacity to intensify or diminish an emotion that we're experiencing, to prolong it or shorten it, or even to switch from one emotional state to another. That's pretty freaking cool. And, you'll note that in the book, I didn't distinguish between positive and negative emotions. All emotions fit in this category of mine of being a gift, being tools that we possess. One thing I should note is that I'm a proponent of the idea that all of our emotions are useful. They are tools.
Yes.
When they are triggered in the right proportions. And what I mean by that is not too intense and for the right amount of time, not too short, not too long. There's a nice fit between the emotional response we have and the urgencies of the situation. That also means that more intense situations may call for emotions to be triggered more intensively. There is information that we derive from negative emotional experiences. Anxiety zooms us in on things that are important to us that we need to prepare. Sadness, that's an emotional response that cues us to introspect about changes in our life that we can't necessarily fix, and we have to rethink how we're going to approach life as a result. These are useful experiences as long as they are not prolonged.
Let's shift, if we could, to getting into the practical offerings in your book of the tools we can use to change our emotions. You talk about two different categories. You talk about internal shifters, focusing on sensations, managing our attention, changing our perspective. And then you get into external shifters, modifying the spaces we inhabit, our relationships with other people, and the power of the cultures that we participate in. So why don't we start from the inside out with our most intimate, visceral experience, which is, I think, our sensations. How can we use our sensations to shift our emotions?
So sensations are one of the easiest tools we possess to relatively effortlessly shift our emotions. The shifts we get aren't always long-lasting, but they are pretty reliable. And what's so interesting to me about this specific type of shifter, these sensory shifters, is I am extremely confident that everyone who is listening has had abundant experiences with these sensory shifters, but we don't often use them strategically when we need them most. I'll tell you a story about this myself. So let's talk about music. I've been listening to music throughout my life. I love listening to music. Scientists have done studies in which you ask people, why do you listen to music? And close to 100% of people say, because I like the way it makes me feel. Certainly true for me. I like the way different songs make me feel. I don't always like admitting which songs I play to make me feel the way I do because I get made fun of by my family and friends. But music pushes my emotions around, right? This has been true since I got my first, CD in the 80s or 90s, MC Hammer. Loved it. But ask me, earlier in my life when things weren't going well and I needed to shift from one state to another, did I avail myself at all of the playlists on my iPhone? No. It was actually an experience with my daughter that helped me realize the power of sensation for managing our emotions strategically. It was just several years ago when I was coaching soccer, and I looked forward to these weekend soccer games. They were like the highlight of the week. And then this one day, my youngest daughter, Danny, she's just totally morose. She's not into it. She's bringing me down. I'm trying to pump her up in all the ways I have at my disposal, all the kind of cheesy dad antics. Nothing is working. We get in the car because I force her to, we're still playing, and the iPhone is hooked up, and on comes one of my favorite songs.
Don't stop believing. Hold on to that feeling.
The moment I hear those sounds, I start getting happy and energized, and I start singing out loud, which normally is something that drives my daughters crazy. It's garlic to vampires or something it's just very aversive. But I look in the rearview mirror and I see Danny, and then she's starting to jam out, and we're having fun, and then we're singing out. I'm louder, and and we're having a great time, and pull up to the field. She runs out of the car, scores what I remembered to be 1,000 goals. I'm exaggerating, but she was just full of energy. And that was a turning point for me that really made me understand how powerful music could be in our lives as a shifter. What's interesting about music in particular as a shifter, as an emotional shifter, is not only do we oftentimes not strategically avail ourselves of that tool, that is to say, when I'm feeling kind of down or not animated, let me immediately go and listen to it. Sometimes we use that modality to actually sink us deeper into a particular emotional state. So there's this phenomenon called this emotional congruency effect, where when you're sad, people reflexively don't listen to Bon Jovi, for me, Pump Up. Instead, they'll go and listen to Adele or Chicago, right? Music that sinks them deeper. And there may be some functionality to that. If the sadness is helping you work through a problem, this can help promote that state even further. But if your goal is not to be sad anymore, then you may be engaging in a behavior that is counterproductive. So,
and this is something that Susan Cain writes about in Bittersweet, which you may have read, that people particularly cherish their sad songs in their playlist. And she sort of makes the case that there's beauty and there's a lot of positive things happening when we explore our sadness through sad music. But I guess you'd make the case that, well, yes, sometimes that's the right modality. Other times it may be time to shift moods, and we underestimate how effective music can be at doing this. Or we know it. We know it has this effect, but there's a knowing-doing gap. Right? People say in surveys that, yes, music profoundly impacts my mood, but in practice, people rarely actually intentionally use music in this way.
Yeah, and I think it's because they understand that it impacts their feelings, but I don't think they often recognize that it is a tool that they can strategically harness to push their feelings around. Like when I get into the car now, I look at the dashboard, see the radio touchscreen, or it's not a radio anymore, but where my Apple Music plays, and I see an emotion regulation device.
Yeah.
I see like all sorts of possibilities for inducing different emotions within me, as well as the people around me. What Susan describes, I completely agree with. There's absolutely no contradiction there whatsoever. There is a beauty in using this as a tool to further a particular kind of emotional state if that state is serving you well. So sadness as an emotion leads us to introspect, try to make meaning out of our experiences. That's often essential to do when we are dealing with loss and adversity.
Yeah.
The key here is I think there's real value in this understanding of how all this works, because it allows us to be much more intentional and strategic and efficient at how we manage our emotional lives.
So you have a pump up playlist, Ethan. You were kind enough to share your pump up playlist with me earlier, featuring not only Journey, but also some Van Halen, some Taylor Swift. You also have a relax playlist. But it occurred to me that, I was thinking about this, that we could have, a whimsical playlist for when we want to be curious and want to explore new topics. There's some music that gets me in sort of a curious, whimsical modality,
Sure.
or analytical, or emotional, or even procreative. I don't know if you have enough kids, Ethan, if you've completed your procreation duties on this planet, but some
we're completed. We're completed. But if you just stop to think about it, like bands used to accompany militaries on these massive wars. Like, why? Right? Like music is a tool. Go to any sporting event, you will hear music. Like you'd be hard pressed to go to any major sporting event that doesn't play music. Some organizations and people do leverage this to their benefit. Some consciously, others unconsciously. I'll give you a few different versions. Like when my kids were little, I tell this story in the book too. We used to go to, these hotels that would smell really nice. And my daughters, Daddy, I love the way it smells here. I want to live here. And,
Right, exactly.
Well, we're not living here because then there's no money for college, sweetie. But mission accomplished by the hotel. So they're working with, scentologists, if that's a term, to develop scents that they pipe through the ventilation to arouse certain kinds of emotional responses in patrons. Art is an emotional enterprise. Think about like populating your house with art that you enjoy, that you appreciate, going to museums. These are all sensory experiences. Food. I mean, you love food.
Scrolling through feeds of baby pandas. Would that count as a visual emotional regulator?
That would qualify, right? Like sight. I mean, if you are skillful and you really want to think about how to really be strategic about using your senses to manage your emotions, you can do some kind of advanced psychological jujitsu moves if you want. For example, our senses are linked with memory. And so have you ever seen this Ratatouille movie? Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
There's this moment where the curmudgeon-y food critic takes a spoon of the ratatouille and then his eyes open up and he sees these images of what it was like to be a kid and being fed by
Yeah.
someone in his family. This is the Proust effect.
Of course, the
This is
Madeleine. Yeah.
right, and eating a Madeleine and reminding of the warmth of having a Madeleine and I think tea when he was young. Those are deep emotional experiences.
Yeah, and I love when you talked about advanced use of the senses. I thought you were going to go to sensory bundles, which you talk
Yeah.
about in the book, which is sort of this lovely notion of, like, one example would be baking,
Yeah.
right? Where you're having an experience of touch, an experience of smell, and I think you have a colleague for whom baking is a powerful regulator.
Baking is a regulator. And, I used to think it was just like wasting time, but this is a way that he regulates. And it's, he very beautifully describes the experience of when he's kneading the dough, he can smell the kind of yeastiness of it and feel its texture between his fingers. And then he bakes it and tastes it. And so there's multiple senses being recruited. For me, I will say that cooking for me has always been one of my great stress relievers. And that's another kind of sensory bundle experience where there's the smells, there's the sensation, the tactile sense of working with a knife and vegetables, and of course, the taste of it all and the sight of it and having it look. And so this is pulling on multiple shifters, multiple levers within us for inducing certain kinds of emotional responses.
Yeah. Well, and we think of activities like surfing or hiking in the woods that are deeply immersive, and those that call upon all of our senses and cognitive abilities because it requires a kind of flow state immersive experience, strike me as being particularly powerful in transporting us. I find, for instance, that for me, if I'm really frustrated, which happens, I'm not that, this doesn't happen that often, Ethan, but now and again, if I really get tied up in a knot, going on a run is the highest probability. If you were to say, Rufus, in 20 minutes, what has the highest probability of completely transforming your state of mind? If I run for 20 minutes and come back, I'm a different human being.
Yeah. And that's, I would say, another emotion regulation cocktail of an experience that you're having, because a few things are happening when you're running. Number one, there is a kind of sensory quality to that experience. There's also some physiological changes that occur in the form of maybe getting to a runner's high and having some endorphins release that are making you feel better. But there's also the attentional component of running, which is, I find that when I go for a run or a walk, my attention gently drifts away from the problem at hand and I start thinking about other things. And in contrast to the widespread belief that avoidance and distraction are always bad, research shows that, in fact, they can often be quite helpful. And so taking your mind away from things for a circumscribed period of time and then coming back to the problem later on, if it's a big one and needs to be addressed, can often be really, really useful, because you come back to the problem and two things have happened. Number one, time has passed, so its intensity has diminished. But you're also able to look at it in a new light with a broader perspective, which can also help you find solutions to the problem. That process that I just described, sometimes I use exercise to help me get that space. Sometimes I do other things. I immerse myself in work. I call up a friend to talk about something else when I'm really, to use your expression, tied up in a knot. It took me some time to really embrace that strategy in my own life, because I was raised to always fix the problem, approach it the moment it surfaces. Don't look away, because looking away is just it's a Band-Aid. It's not going to actually fix it. And so I no longer do as much, and to my benefit.
Well, and this actually gets to the heart of, I think, a really important core question that I think you're taking a relatively strong position on, which is our cultural conventional wisdom has been that if you have an emotional problem, you need to address that problem, dig into it, confront it, as you say. If you go and try to distract yourself, you're not facing the problem. And that's sort of a cowardly or escapist move. And I think that you are in this book and in your work very consciously taking a contrarian position here, saying actually avoidance, which would be the pejorative term for shifting, avoidance can be a very useful and sometimes strategically effective tool in your toolbox. There's a time and a place for avoidance. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a very accurate representation. I mean, I was raised to think you always approach the problem, work through it. It's cowardly not to. Then I got to graduate school, and that message was reinforced with study after study and professor after professor who told me avoidance equals bad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, chronic avoidance is bad. Like chronically avoiding and not focusing ever on a problem. There's reams of data linking that to negative outcomes. Indisputably. I have no qualms with that conclusion. I believe it. The problem is we generalize from that conclusion to all forms of avoidance. And all forms of avoidance are not bad. So the ability to be strategic in how you deploy your attention, dosing the bad stuff at times, taking time away and letting things cool down before you re-engage, this can sometimes be really, really effective.
Could you tell us the story of your grandmother and how that affected your thinking?
So I grew up going to my grandmother's house after school each day in elementary school and junior high school. She was like a second mother figure, lived a few blocks away from me, cooked for me, cared for me. There was nothing I could really do wrong. You know, that kind of,
wonderful.
It was just this wonderful, wonderful figure. And, she was emotive and loving, a source of tremendous strength. And she also had this captivating backstory, which was she grew up in Eastern Europe, in Poland, right around the time when the Nazis invaded. And she witnessed when she was a young adult, her entire family be slaughtered. Virtually her entire family was slaughtered and, fled from ghetto to ghetto, woods to woods, evading people who were just trying to kill her. And I knew about her experience because my parents would tell me about it, and I would often ask her to tell me about these experiences. And she would never talk to me about the experience. She would continually tell me, don't ask questions about this, focus on other stuff. But then once a year, I would be dragged to attend these mandatory, for me, Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremonies that she and her fellow survivors had organized. Little assembly in a local synagogue often. And I would see her become incredibly emotional in a way that I had never really seen her outside of this one day. And she would just let it loose for the entire day, like just let all the emotion out. And then after that, she never went there. And so that was a giant puzzle for me, how this woman who achieved the extraordinary, she survived, didn't just survive, then moved here with nothing, worked really hard, made a life for herself, ultimately owned not just a house in Brooklyn, but a winter pad in Miami, helped subsidize my education. I mean, lived to her early 90s. She lived a remarkably successful life. But she avoided talking about this experience all the time, which was opposite of what my parents told me to do growing up when I struggled with things. Don't avoid. And certainly when I went into the field, I learned that chronic avoidance isn't good. And so now, that I've been in the field long enough and I know more about the science behind attention and avoidance and coping, I now have a new lens to understand her experience, which was she was not chronically avoiding thinking about what was happening to her. She was much more strategic. She would dose it.
I wonder what you think about talk therapy. This collective assumption that avoidance is always a bad thing and that talking more and more and more about whatever the problem is the right solution is certainly part of the kind of psychoanalytic tradition and continues to be part of I think a core assumption of many therapists. And I wonder whether you would have any disagreements with the conventional wisdom there.
I think talk therapy is enormously helpful for lots of people in lots of situations. And we take talk therapy, I'm empirically supported forms of it. Not all are. I think this does dramatic good in the world, on the planet. A lot of the tools that I talk about in this book are delivered more intensively in the context of therapy. It's kind of supercharged the dosage, if you will, of those tools. So I'm a huge proponent if you think it is helpful for you or if you find that it is. But what I'm not a proponent of is forcing people into talk therapy as the tool for managing all of their emotional maladies. Nor am I a proponent of forcing people to talk about everything that's bugging them. I'm not a proponent of that because I know the data around these topics. And what we have learned is that there are different combinations of tools that work for different people. There are lots of individual differences here. Talking works great for some people, but there are lots of other tools that people can benefit from as well. Some of the most powerful research for me in this area was done in New York City around the time of 9/11, right in the aftermath of the Twin Towers coming down. I was actually just started graduate school back then, and there was all this talk about how important it was going to be to give everyone essentially access to therapeutic care so they could, especially people at around ground zero, so they could talk about what happened to them and just not keep it inside, get it out. Well, fast forward a couple of years, there's this longitudinal research that tracks people's adjustment over time and also indexes the different coping behaviors that they engage in. And what they find across different studies is that talking, was often benign and sometimes even harmful for some people if you force them to talk about their experiences.
Right.
So I think we need to really shift the way we think about intervening when it comes to helping people manage their emotions. It is, if there's one message I hope people take away from this book, it is that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions, and that the more we cling to that idea, the more likely we are to be unsuccessful in really moving the needle on our collective capacity to regulate our emotions.
And your book Shift, I think of as kind of a toolbox of techniques that can be used. I'm going to be more controversial in my statement here than you were. I think there's an incentive problem with attorneys, which is it's always in the interest of your lawyer to be alarmist and to do more work. And they can tell themselves that that's benefiting you because they're being very thorough. But your incentives aren't completely aligned. Ideally, the objective of a therapist should be to become unnecessary as fast as possible, right? To give you the tools to solve your problems as quickly as possible. That of course, has the effect of them losing the work, the engagement, right? So there's an interesting mix of dynamics, and I think certainly we can all agree that having a wide range of tools that we can experiment with to solve our own problems and become self-sufficient in solving our problems and regulating our own emotions as quickly as possible is a positive.
That's the goal, right? The goal is to be efficient. I mean, I talk about this also in Shift, the law of least work. This is a powerful principle that governs how we operate, right? We're trying to conserve resources at any given moment in time. One of the reasons I start the section on tools, on shifters, by talking about sensation is it's probably the least effortful tool available, right? It's really easy to put on a song and feel differently. But that's the goal. We don't have time and energy to just endlessly struggle to manage our emotions. Sometimes we do need more intense forms of intervention, but the hope here is that we can make people jiu-jitsu black belts when it comes to shifting and pushing their emotions around. Like jiu-jitsu, if you've ever seen it, it's this effortless art where someone's coming at you with some momentum and force, and you make a tiny move and you shift the entire trajectory of that exchange. And that's really the goal here, right? It's those micro shifts: approach, avoid, music on, off, broaden my perspective, narrow it in, talk to this person in this way, move here and check out this physical space or not. Little things that if you know what to do, you can do it when you're struggling to push you in the right direction.
Another tool we can use is changing our perspective. And I think one of the ways we can do that is through distanced self-talk, which you also talk about in Chatter, but I think is a powerful tool here. I was fascinated by the research done on social posts and how the excessive use of first-person pronouns, I, me, my, was associated with an increased probability of romantic fallouts, right? And also predictive in a big study of Facebook posts of diagnoses of depression, right? People using more first-person pronouns. What's wrong with the use of first person? Why is this true?
Well, there's nothing wrong, we should be clear, with using I, me, my. Continue thinking about your life, with those parts of speech. But what we have seen is that there are times where, particularly when people are experiencing strong negative emotions like depression, they immerse themselves in that experience. And a linguistic marker of that is first person singular pronouns. Think about it. And if we think about this in very simple terms, I think this makes a great deal of sense, right? You're depressed about something in your life. You're thinking about, how do I feel my feelings? This is all about you right now. And so that immersed focus on yourself, it's spilling out into the words you use to talk about your life to other people. And that's the logic behind why we see this link between first person singular pronouns, I, me, my, and these enhanced negative emotional states. Now, what we've also seen, which we reference in your question, is that you can take this phenomenon further and get people to use those first person singular pronouns less to help them manage their emotions. One way that we've studied this is asking people to try to work through their problems using the second person pronoun you when they're struggling. All right, Ethan, you've got this. Here's what you should do.
Yeah.
And this is an easy tool to use. It's one of my first lines of defense when I'm finding myself getting tied up in a knot. Why does it work? Well, it shifts our perspective. We are often much better at giving advice to other people than we are giving advice to ourselves. This is such a powerful phenomenon in my life. Like, my God, I can give my buddies such good advice about their struggles, but then I'm in the situation and I've got like a cold compress on my head and help me, Think about, Rufus, when do you use the word you?
Well, this is great news for me, Ethan, because I've had a long-standing tendency to talk to myself in the third person. Come on, Rufus, you've got this, and I'm delighted to learn it's not a sign of schizophrenia, but rather a sophisticated emotional regulation technique. But I'll tell you something else that I tend to do is I find myself talking to myself in first person plural. Come on, folks, we can do it.
Yeah, that's another kind of distancing tool.
Right, which actually feels good to me, and because it sort of suggests that we're a team, we're a collective force. I don't know if there's some acknowledgement of the illusion of a singular self. I contain multitudes, but there's something about like referring to myself as we.
Well, we is also, it's first person plural. You're a part of we, but so are other entities. So that's what I mean when I say there's some distance.
What other forms of perspective shifting are there, Ethan? There's time travel, and there's also, I think, very powerfully seeing our smallness before the extraordinary universe in which we exist. These are tools that I think you use personally.
Oh yeah, so distant self-talk is very accessible in my toolbox. Mental time travel, so thinking about how I'm going to feel about something down the road, that often helps because most of the difficulties I faced, as intense as they've been, have faded with time. And so how am I going to feel about this next week, next month, next year? That reminds me that however intense what I'm going through is, it will eventually subside. Mental time travel into the past is a perspective broadener. Oh my God, boy, look at my calendar and all of the rejections and stress I'm encountering right now. All right, let me jump into the mental time travel machine and go hang out with Buppy in the woods of Eastern Europe as she's fleeing the Nazis. Right. That puts my experience in perspective.
Sure.
Experiencing awe, like finding opportunities to experience this emotion that we have when we're in the presence of something vast and indescribable. there are awe triggers all around, right? They're in the local parks, human innovation. I could find triggers of awe very easily. That broadens my perspective. Like, really? You're worried about this when people are struggling to figure out how to colonize Mars? Like, let's put your problems in perspective. Then there's also a fun one, maybe less accessible to all, but I love this research. Thinking about your problems in a foreign language. So, I find this so interesting, in part because I speak 2 other languages. Maybe that's being generous to say I speak them. I kind of cobble or stumble through them, and when I'm talking to someone in those languages. But I can say the most vile things in those languages, and I never feel inappropriate for doing so. Have you ever had that experience of cursing in a foreign language and it just doesn't have the same sting as it does when you're in your native tongue?
It sounds funny. Merde. Yeah.
Exactly. It sounds funny. So that experience is more representative of our experience of emotions in a foreign language. So when we think about our problems in a foreign language, it doesn't have the same emotional impact. And part of the reason for that, we think, is because we learn about our emotions in our native languages. Those are the linguistic code through which we first have these emotional experiences, and we store them away in our minds. And so when you think about an intense event in a second language, it kind of strips away some of its emotional qualities. And that makes it easier to think about those experiences more objectively. And there's some really interesting research in that space.
I'm Jessie Hempel, host of Hello Monday. In my 20s, I knew what I wanted from my career. But from where I am now, in the middle of my life, nothing feels as certain. Work's changing, we're changing, and there's no guidebook for how to make sense of any of it. So every Monday, I bring you conversations with people who are thinking deeply about work and where it fits into our lives. We talk about making career pivots, about purpose and how to discern it, about where happiness fits into the mix, and how to ask for more money. Come join us in the Hello Monday community. Let's figure out the future together. Listen to Hello Monday with Jessie Hempel wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Alex Kantrowitz. I'm the host of Big Technology Podcast, a longtime reporter and an on-air contributor to CNBC. And if you're like me, you're trying to figure out how artificial intelligence is changing the business world and our lives. So each week on Big Technology, I bring on key actors from companies building AI tech and outsiders trying to influence it, asking where this is all going. They come from places like NVIDIA, Microsoft, Amazon, and plenty more. So if you want to be smart with your wallet, your career choices, in meetings with your colleagues, and at dinner parties, tune into Big Technology Podcast on your app of choice.
In his new book, Shift, my guest, Ethan Kross, groups emotional shifters into 2 broad categories. First, there are internal shifters. These are the ones we've been talking about. Sensory shifters like music, or perspective shifters like talking to yourself in the third person. The second category that Ethan writes about, external shifters. And one of the easiest external shifters to master is dialing your mood by changing your surroundings.
Okay, well, there are 2 ways to do this. The first is we form attachments to places similar to how we form attachments to people. And I think we sometimes forget this. And in the same way that someone who you are securely attached to can be a source of resilience during times of stress, so can places. When my kids were young and they didn't feel good about something, they would constantly, their initial response would be like, I just want to go home. I just want to go back to my room. They were securely attached to that place, and it was a source of comfort and security to them. We form these positive attachments to places all over the place. Sorry for the repetition there. And if we are strategic about where those places are, now we have a map of, I call these little emotional oases in our environment that we can visit. But then there are local ways of designing your environments that can be helpful as well. And here the two principles are: you can add things to your spaces to increase the likelihood that you will experience certain kinds of emotional responses throughout the day. So photographs are a perfect example. We did this one set of studies where we wanted to see whether just looking at a picture of a loved one would have some restorative regulatory benefits. So we did these studies where sometimes we would flash a picture of someone you loved, your mom, a partner, before we had you think of a really painful experience. And in other versions of the study, we would have you think about a painful experience, and then we'd flash the picture.
Yeah.
What we found is that looking at a picture beforehand didn't do anything. Like, the thoughts about the negative experience just overwhelmed any positive feelings that were conjured up from initially looking. But if you glance at the photo after thinking about that experience, it helped you recover much more quickly. So we took a couple of years to do these studies and publish it. And the moment I was done, I said to my wife, I need picture frames. And she's thinking, you've never once asked for a picture frame in your life. You've never had photos in your office. What is going on? And I explained it. And now I have photos all over the place in my offices.
It's funny because I have not tended to do that, but having read that chapter of your book, I think that I will. Wonderful, images of frolicking with the kids and the family and friends, because it is so powerful. I've tended to think of it as a bit sentimental, but I can see that kind of transporting.
Well, you just said it.
Effect.
Sentimental. That is an emotional phenomenon, right? And it's so low-hanging, easy to do. It's the reason why there's a picture of my family on my iPhone screensaver, right? Like my daughter and 2 kids. And then there's also removing things from your environment that may be triggers in the wrong direction. So I have a goal of not eating unhealthy past 8 p.m. If pizza is in the refrigerator past 8 p.m., that goal is violated. I will eat the pizza under all circumstances. So I get rid of the pizza if we have leftovers. And what I'm doing there is I'm modifying my environment to help reduce triggers, emotional triggers that I don't want to have. So these are ways of playing with your spaces.
You've said, Ethan, that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for managing emotions. But if there's one variable that's universally effective, I would have to think that it's building healthy relationships with other people. Only connect, as E.M. Forrester put it. Would you agree that this is a big one, a big variable?
It's a huge variable. What I'd throw back to you is, what does it mean to have a healthy relationship with someone else?
Yeah.
In particular, when it comes to finding someone to talk to about your problems.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that there is, you could call it a kind of formula for giving good support to others. And on the flip side, if you're the one seeking it, trying to find the right people to talk to about your problems. This is, I would call it a formula that if you implement in your life, it has a pretty high ROI, because a lot of people don't know how to help. And sometimes we do things that don't help at all and even make things worse. So I'll give you a concrete example of this. A lot of people think that the key to providing good support is just to be there for someone and let them vent their emotions, talk it out. I talked a little bit about this in Chatter. I do it again in Shift. There's a lot of research on this. And what we know is that venting your emotions to someone else is good for strengthening the friendship and relational bonds between people. It's good to know there are other people who are willing to listen to you.
Yes.
But if all you do is vent about a problem, you leave that conversation feeling good about your relationship with the person you just spoke to, but the problem is still there. So the best kinds of conversations over time do two things. First, it is important for you to get out what you're dealing with the person you're speaking to, establishing those relational bonds, being empathized with, learning that you're not alone. These are all really important for helping people work through big emotional events. But ideally, you at some point get to a point in the conversation where the person's helping shift your perspective. They're helping you reframe. That other person is in an ideal position to do that because the problem's not happening to them. They are, in essence, in a position where they can pull the other internal shifters that we spoke about that I may not be able to pull on my own. So someone else can help me broaden my perspective. Someone else can help me divert my attentional spotlight. The other day I was ruminating about something and my wife, she commiserated with me about it. That felt great. She then didn't help me broaden my perspective alone. She actually helped me distract and think about something else, which was really productive. So other people are huge in that regard. The message I'd love readers to internalize, though, is think carefully about who you put in your emotional advisory network because they exert a huge influence on your life.
Yes.
And we don't always think really carefully about who we go to chat with about the things that are bugging us. And the science provides us with some criteria for evaluating who does a really good job and who doesn't.
You have a great line in the book. In the same way a startup carefully vets its trusted advisors, we should think carefully about who we are recruiting to co-regulate our emotions. That really stuck with me because it's having built a few startups. I mean, running a business, you think a lot about who you go to for counsel. Right?
It's huge.
In a way that I think in our personal lives, we tend to be less, I think, thoughtful and reflective about the vetting of who's going to help us, as you say, co-regulate our emotions.
And let me just pull on that thread a second longer, Rufus. I mean, isn't that mind-blowing? I mean, yes, we care about our success in the business world in a fiscal or even purpose-driven way. We want to be successful. But to put so much effort and resources into thinking about who our business advisors are and then not placing any attention to that issue in our personal lives, which, like, what is more important in the end than our own personal well-being? And it's just the asymmetry there is, to me, so striking. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I'm also fascinated by like this nuance that you just shared, which is that it is possible to interact with our friends and our, trusted emotional co-regulators, as you put it, in a way that deepens our relationship with them because we feel a sense of closeness and bonding, but does not actually help us or is even possibly counterproductive in helping us address our problems, right? So if we're doing nothing but venting, or what's also called co-ruminating, it can have the effect of increasing that warm sense of a connection and friendship we have. This person really has my back.
Yeah.
But it can actually cause us to get deeper into a set of not pull back, not, change our perspective. That's, I think, something that I had not thought about before reading your book.
Yeah, it's highly prevalent. Like, what makes it so easy for us to fall into this trap is there's this seductive allure to commiserating or co-ruminating about an issue. In the moment, it feels really good to just go over the issues that are bothering us and have someone there with us telling us, like egging us on almost, and telling us it's okay, and knowing that they're on our side. But that's just kind of placing fuel on the burning fire.
Right. It's all the other. Let's say it's a conflict with another person. Oh, it's all their fault. Oh, it's outrageous this other person did this thing.
I mean, come on, Rufus, you probably sprinkle in a few expletives when you're saying that too, if it's a really close friend, right? And that feels even better. Or am I projecting now?
Well, I don't think I typically ask friends for this kind of validation. In a lot of ways, I'm a very typical sort of emotionally self-reliant male.
Yeah.
Right. For me, the challenge is more deciding to tell my friends, you know what, I'm kind of in a funk. I'm actually feeling down. That for me is not a natural thing to do. Even though I have a lot of close friendships, I think I have a classically kind of self-sufficient, independent male perspective. Yeah. But I've taught myself to do that. Just last Sunday, I called up several friends and said, you know what, I'm in a funk. I just read Ezra Klein's op-ed, This is the Time of Monsters, and I'm feeling really down about the world and our collective future, and I just want to share that with you. And after 2 or 3 conversations, I felt a lot better. But I had to push myself to say that, to tell people I'm feeling down.
That's a great segue to talking about the penultimate topic that I address in the book, which is how do you go from knowledge to action? What you just described, you have resistance to this in the same way that so many of us have resistance to acting on the knowledge we have. This is a pervasive tendency. And what I love about this phenomenon that we point out is that scientists have shined their crosshairs on it, and they've come up with solutions to help us take knowledge and convert it into action. And they figured out how to help us do it automatically. And so there's a framework, a technique that has a lot of evidence behind it. I love it. It's called WHOOP. So we should cue up the music
I love
here.
this.
I will say that I did start when we were, fact checking. The song is actually Whoop, There It Is, not Whoop, There It Is. But I think I can take some literary license here and
Absolutely.
And make the M silent. So the question is, why do we fail to convert knowledge into action when we have like a specific goal to do so? And WHOOP is a technique that systematically helps us overcome that problem. And here's how it works. So it's an acronym. WHOOP, step 1. I want you to identify what your wish is. What's your goal, right? Your goal is probably to be more well-adjusted and rely on your network more. What's an outcome that might come from you achieving that goal? Why don't you fill in the blank for me?
My wish is to have less friction in our nuclear family.
Mm-hmm.
And the outcome that I desire is more laughter and harmony.
Okay, and let's pause right there. So you've now articulated a specific, concrete goal. So now we actually have our eyes set on something. And you've gone over the outcome. If you achieve this, what is possible? And that's an important step in this process now, because now we're energized. Like, that's a really great outcome. As I hear you describe that, like, I want that outcome. That's something worth devoting energy to. Okay, now let's go to the second O in WHOOP, which is obstacle. What is the internal obstacle that could get in the way of you achieving this wish that you have?
So I would say that it's being too easily triggered by disagreements about various things within the family, about, let's say, contributing to setting the table before dinner, getting the kids engaged in helping the family. Meanwhile, they're thinking, I have too much homework to do that. That's an unreasonable request. And I'm prioritizing, or I'm having an emotional response too quickly and aggressively.
Okay, so you've identified your obstacle, which is having a trigger reaction when you are defied. Now let's come up with a P. What's your plan? So, and if with the plan that we're talking about, now I want you to develop a plan that is specifically targeted to addressing this obstacle. So we call these implementation intentions, and they have a structure. If fill in the blank, this happens, then fill in the blank with a shifting tool that you are going to use to address it. So if your child tells you, get lost, I'm not doing that because I have homework, and you could set up the table, and you have a reaction, then fill in the blank. What are you going to do?
Right. I mean, something I've occasionally done, but not very effectively, is to rehearse in my mind, here's what I'm going to say. Here's a humorous way that I can respond to that objection.
Perfect.
Right?
So that's your then, right? So if I get disrespected and my son doesn't listen to me, and I find myself getting hot under the collar, then I'm going to diffuse a situation with humor. And so if you were to go through this WHOOP, what I would then ask you to do is rehearse that if-then plan a few times. And so the whole purpose of this exercise is, We've identified an area that you're committed to. It's really important to you that you want to start regulating more effectively in. We've energized you to pursue this goal by having you focus on what's possible if you're successful. But we've also been really tactical in getting you to think about potential obstacles that might get in the way of you being successful. And we haven't just gotten you to think about the obstacle. Now we've gotten you to articulate a very specific plan that you are going to rehearse a few times. And by rehearsing it, guess what? Once this happens, you're not going to have to pause and think, and maybe do something you regret or not do anything at all. But you will now have a tactic that you can implement without even thinking automatically in the heat of the moment.
You know, I was amazed by this section. You cite a study some German scientists did with a classroom of first graders. These are 6-year-olds, right? They had them go through this whoop technique 5 times. And what they found was these 6-year-old kids managed their emotions better, they earned better grades, and when they did a follow-up 3 years later, the positive effects were still present. So this would appear to be a very powerful, scientifically validated effect that's fundamentally about just thinking through in advance, what's this cyclical pattern of what's the obstacle, what's the better response, and just training yourself to be prepared to do that. Now, one other topic I'd love to hit is you have a whole section of the book. You kind of go from these internal regulators, engaging the senses, changing perspectives, to external factors, spaces, other people, and then you broaden all the way out to cultures. And this strikes me as something that a lot of people maybe don't think about as much as they might, which is particularly early in your life and in your career, we make decisions about where to live, who to work for, what communities to join. And in choosing the cultures that we elect to be a part of, we actually make pretty important decisions, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's easy to take culture for granted when we think about our emotions and our emotional lives because it in many ways is invisible, but yet it is also omnipresent. So culture is often compared to the air we breathe. It's all around us. We're all parts of different cultures and we move in and out of different cultures often throughout the day. Families that we belong to, friend groups, those are one kind of culture. The places we work, the teams we're a part of, these are all different cultures. How are they related to emotions and emotion regulation? I like to break culture down into 3 components. Culture shapes our values and our beliefs. Cultures also provide us with norms, rules, both sometimes explicit, but sometimes implicit, for how you manage emotional conflict. And then finally, cultures give us practices. They give us tools for managing our emotions. Cultures give us rituals, right? Think of religion as a kind of culture, lots of rituals that come with it. There are organizational rituals we have for how we deal with adversity. In my home, if we think of a family culture, I'm constantly giving myself tools to help them manage the world in the form of lessons that I teach them, sometimes to their dismay, but I'm trying to give them tools to give them an edge. I'm teaching them about the virtue of perspective broadening and talking to me about things in a particular way and so forth and so on.
It strikes me that in the first half of our lives, the cultures that we choose to join and be a part of are very important decisions. I mean, cities have different cultures. Again, companies, universities, communities, collections of friends. In the middle of our lives and the second half of our lives, I think the ways that we choose to build our own cultures in our own nuclear families, in our own business enterprises, and in the ways that we participate in and contribute to our communities is another important choice, right? That we're both consumers of these cultures, participants in them, and we can have an impact on them as well.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said it that way, Rufus, because those are the 2 possibilities here. Because sometimes we find ourselves in cultures that are not working for us. One choice we have is to change cultures by switching from one culture to another. But then you can also try to modify the culture from inside. Regardless of whether you're in a leadership position or more, lower down on the hierarchy, there are typically things you can do to nudge those values and norms and give some practices there. And so I think just being aware of this powerful role that culture has on us can be helpful for thinking about some of the broader forces that, shape the emotional trajectory of our lives.
Now, in the course of writing this book, Ethan, have you gotten better at regulating your own emotions? Have you seen it change there?
I would say it's if I were to plot the trajectory of my emotion regulatory success over time, it would look, fortunately, mostly like the stock market does over the past several years, in the sense that it's a linear positive increase, although there are some small divots, sometimes a little bit larger, and then some big spikes, which is to say I've had real successes. And by successes, I mean I've encountered challenges that 5 or 10 years ago would have taken me longer to recover from, and I've recovered from them much more quickly. But then I've been presented with new kinds of curveballs that I haven't encountered that, have set me back a little bit, but that I've ultimately recovered very well from. And I'm constantly getting better. So when I think of how good I am at managing my emotions, I think I'm pretty good. I want to go up to bat against Nolan Ryan. And I'm not going to hit the ball every single time. And Nolan Ryan may be an older pitcher for some listeners, but he was a great one in baseball. But I think I've got a shot at doing pretty well. And that is the kind of confidence that I have based on my knowledge of this science.
That was Ethan Kross. His new book, Shift, comes out in February, but you can pre-order a copy by following the link in the episode notes. If you're curious about Ethan's first book, Chatter, I interviewed him about it on the show back in 2021. There's a link to that conversation in the show notes as well. Finally, did this episode inspire you to make pump up and chill out playlists? If so, send them to us, and if you're one of the first 5 people we hear from, we'll give you a lifetime membership to our acclaimed Substack newsletter, Book of the Day. Every weekday, you'll get handcrafted summaries of a brilliant new book right in your inbox. And on weekends, you'll get essays from me, bonus content from this show, and more. So send your playlist to podcast@nextbigideaclub.com. Very curious to hear your playlist. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. Working with the team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network always shifts us into a good mood. Next week, how LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman learned to stop worrying and love AI. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you then.
Hi, I'm Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn and co-host of Possible, a podcast where we explore building a brighter future with technology and map out how to get there. I recently spoke with Fei-Fei Li on human-centered AI, Bill Gates on AI's impact on climate change and health, and Sean White on empathetic AI. Curious about what's possible? Listen wherever you get your podcasts.